They numbered the prisoners by order of capture, and the number they gave her was 47. She did not know this until the fourth day, when a guard bent down and pressed the tag into her palm. The tag was made of something she did not recognize. Not metal, not plastic, not any material her fingers could name. It held warmth the way a stone holds warmth after a long afternoon sun, and the warmth did not diminish. She read the number in the dim amber glow that passed for light in her cell and held the tag against her chest. And the warmth spread through the fabric of her suit and into her sternum, and she thought, this is the only thing on this ship that feels like something I have ever touched before. Prisoner 47. Her name was Dr. Mara Chellan. She had been a mathematician at the Kerning Institute for 12 years before she became something else. She remembered that much. The rest came in pieces, the way the images always came, slow, unwilling, surfacing like wreckage after a storm. The Vorath did not use sound to speak. This was the first thing the linguists had tried to tell the public, and the public had not understood, because the public imagined aliens who pointed at things and made noises that could be painstakingly mapped to concepts. The Vorath did not point, and they did not make sounds. They communicated through bioluminescent patterns that rippled across their outer membrane, a translucent skin the color of old ice, and the patterns moved faster than the human eye could resolve without augmentation. The linguists wore retinal implants. They worked in teams of 4 because no single human brain could parse the full bandwidth of what the Vorath said at once, and even with 4 of them they were catching roughly 60% of the signal. They called the other 40% the gap, and the gap was where all the problems lived. Mara was not a linguist. She had been called to the joint contact team because the patterns were mathematical. Someone had noticed that the light pulses followed sequences, and someone above that someone had pulled her file, and then there was a phone call, and a flight, and a series of hallways beneath a building she was not supposed to know existed, and then there was a room. In the room there was a screen. On the screen there was light. She stared at it for a long time without saying anything. She did not take notes immediately. She had a habit, which she had tried and failed to break over the course of a professional lifetime, of watching things without recording them. At first, letting the pattern settle into her, letting it find its own shape in whatever part of her brain processed pattern before words arrived. Her graduate students had hated this habit. They wanted frameworks and terminology and the reassurance that came from having something to write down. She understood their need and could not share it. She watched the screen for perhaps 20 minutes. Then she said to the room, "They're counting, not in any base human mathematics used. Not base 10, not base 2, not any of the 7 alternative counting systems she had studied at the Institute. They were counting in something that had no name yet, something whose logic she could feel before she could articulate it. A system built, not on units but on ratios, not on quantity but on relationship, on the space between numbers rather than the numbers themselves. She felt it the way she had felt her first real proof at the age of 9, sitting at her mother's kitchen table with a book too old for her, not as an act of learning, but as an act of recognition, as if the knowledge had always been in her, and the problem was simply showing her where to. She said, "Give me 6 weeks." They gave her 4. She didn't sleep during most of it. The team brought her coffee she didn't drink, and food she ate, standing up, still writing. She covered 3 whiteboards and then began layering transparencies over them, writing on the glass over her own equations, building strata of mathematics that her graduate students would later call the Chellan matrices, without knowing what they had been made for. She had 2 assistants, bright young people, who asked good questions and kept meticulous records, and who she genuinely liked, though she could not now remember their faces. She could remember the feeling of the marker in her hand, and the specific quality of the fluorescent light at 3 in the morning, and the way the Vorath signal on the screen seemed to breathe, to pulse, to wait the way water waits to be disturbed. On the morning of the 28th day, she walked into the briefing and put her notes on the table and said, "I know what they're measuring." Silence from the uniforms arranged along the far wall. A hand raised by Dr. Amara Osi, the lead linguist, whose retinal implants gave her eyes a faint copper sheen, that Mara had found unnerving in the first week, and had since come to find oddly reassuring, the way you come to find reassuring anything constant in an uncertain environment. "They're measuring us," Mara said. "Every signal they've sent since we detected them, 11 months ago, has been a measurement. They are not communicating in the sense we've been hoping. They're cataloging. They want to know what we are, how we're built, what our limits are. The mathematical sequences are not answers to questions we've asked Wust. They are questions. And they've been waiting to see if we could read them." Silence again. "And can we?" Someone asked from the back of the room. She couldn't see who. She didn't look. She looked at her notes. She thought about the warmth of the alien tag she did not yet know she would one day hold in a cell on a ship she had not yet been taken to. She thought about recognition, the feeling of it. "I just did," she said. They called the protocol the Imago Initiative. It was someone's idea of clever. The imago is the final, complete form of an insect, the adult stage that emerges from metamorphosis, transformed beyond anything the larva was or could have predicted. The idea behind the name was that humanity stood at a threshold. First contact was not a single moment, but a transformation, a process, and what came out the other side would not be what went in. Mara had hated the name on principle. She disliked metaphors that flattered the species using them, and imago suggested an endpoint, a completion, a state of having arrived. And in her experience, nothing was ever complete, no proof ever final, no understanding ever done being challenged. The universe had no interest in flattery. Now, sitting in the Vorath cell with the tag warm against her palm, she thought the name might have been more precise than anyone intended. Not because humanity had reached its final form, because the word itself, in the Vorath patternage language she had been spending her days decoding from the wall scratches she made each night, meant something slightly different than its English cognate. It meant not the arrived state, but the arriving. Not the butterfly, but the breaking of the chrysalis. Not the destination, but the first moment of flight. She could not remember how she had come to be on the ship. This was the central wound in her memory, the gap that the interrogators, if that was what they were, kept probing at with the patient impersonality of people who have waited a very long time and intend to wait longer. They came twice daily, sometimes 3 times. They stood at the edges of the room, which had no right angles, and their membranes pulsed with light. A device on the wall translated the patterns into synthetic speech, flat, effectless, with none of the tonal gradient that would tell a human whether a question was urgent or curious or hostile. They asked her the same question each session, in the same sequence she had catalogued in her notes before her capture. The question meant, as best she could reconstruct from the translator's output. "Did you see? What did you record? What does it mean?" She kept saying she didn't know. This was partly true. The part of her that knew, and there was a part, she could feel its weight, the dense specific pressure of something large kept in a small space. That part was separated from her by the gap in her memory, 48 hours, or 72, or however long the missing time encompassed. She could feel the edge of it. She could not cross it. She spent a great deal of time in those early days pressing against the edge, the way you press with your tongue against a loose tooth, not because it feels good, but because the not pressing would feel worse. The ship smelled of nothing. This was amongst the things she could not stop noticing. She had expected something biological and wrong, something her nervous system would reject as chemical evidence of the alien. Instead, nothing. A total absence of olfactory information, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean of history. She found this more disturbing than any strangeness she might have prepared herself for. In the absence of smell, she attended more closely to the other senses. The ambient sound was a low vibration at the edge of perception, not mechanical, not quite organic, something between, as if the ship itself was breathing through a process she did not have the right framework to understand yet. The light was amber and constant, and came from no visible source. The surfaces of the room were smooth and slightly warm, and gave slightly under pressure, like something not quite solid. She had spent 2 days investigating the geometry of the room with her hands before concluding that the angles were not wrong by accident. The room had been made by beings whose spatial cognition operated on different assumptions than human spatial cognition, and what felt like wrong stuff was simply to difference. She filed this under things I know now that I did not know before. The file was growing rapidly. On the 5th day she began doing mathematics in her head. Not the Vorath signal work, not yet. She had catalogued what she could recall of the signal sequences from memory, and she was not ready to work with that material cold, without her notes, without the ability to check herself. Instead, she did what she had always done in difficult moments since the age of 9. She worked proofs. Clean, abstract, entirely human mathematics. She worked through a proof she had first encountered in a graduate topology course, and had always thought was inelegant in its final step, and she found a cleaner path this time, in the amber light of the Vorath cell, and the finding of it filled her with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with her circumstances, and everything to do with what she was. This was something she had never been able to explain to anyone who was not also a mathematician, that the beauty of a proof was not in its utility. Proof could be beautiful without being useful to anyone or anything. The beauty was in its internal logic, in the way it moved from what was known to what had not yet been known, in the click of the final step landing into place like a bone back into a joint. She had tried explaining this to Priya once, lying on Priya's narrow bed in Priya's faculty apartment with the window open and street sounds coming up from below, and Priya had listened with her eyes closed and then said, "That's what music is." And Mara had said she didn't know anything about music, and Priya had said, "I know," and she had hummed something. She was always humming, and Mara had swatched the ceiling and listened and thought, yes, maybe, something like that. She worked proofs in her head for 3 days before she started reading the light. She had been a mathematician. She had spent her adult life in the conviction that the universe was fundamentally legible, that underneath apparent chaos there were patterns, and underneath the patterns there were rules, and underneath the rules there was something she did not have a word for but felt as clearly as she felt anything. This conviction had made her very good at her work, and somewhat difficult as a colleague, and almost impossible as a friend, because she could not stop looking for the patterns in everything. In conversation, in people's faces, in the way grief moved through a room, in the specific timbre of a person's voice when they were pretending to be fine. She looked for patterns in her captors. This was, she realized slowly, exactly what they were doing to her. They came every day, sometimes twice. Their membrane light was complex and fast, and the translator caught perhaps half of it. She watched the sequencing of their pulses, the way she had once watched the sequencing of their transmissions. She began keeping a record, scratching notation into the soft material of the cell wall with the edge of the tag. Small marks that looked like nothing in particular, private language whose grammar she was inventing as she went, mapped to the light patterns she was learning to read, because she needed to do something with what she knew, because she was human, and humans, when put in small places with no apparent exit, with no tools and no allies, and no information about whether anyone was looking for them, or whether they even had a name anymore, only a number pressed into their hand by a being with no face they could read, humans begin immediately and without instruction to look for a way out. Not from hope necessarily, not from any calculation about likelihood of success, from something more fundamental, something in the body, something that long predated calculation. On the 9th day, one of them stayed after the others left. It stood at the far edge of the room and pulsed, slowly, a pattern she had not seen before. She watched it carefully. It pulsed again, the same sequence, and she recognized the grammatical structure. Not the specific meaning, but the shape of the thing. The way you can recognize a question in a language you don't speak yet, just by its tonal contour, she said, out loud into the empty air. "I don't know what you're asking." The membrane lit in a way she had begun to associate, from her wallitation sessions, with something like acknowledgement. Not agreement, not affirmation. Acknowledgement. "I register that you have spoken," she said, "but I'm going to figure it out." The light again. Something in the cadence of it made her think. She knew this was projection, and allowed the possibility, anyway, of someone who had expected exactly this response. and had been waiting to see whether she would produce it. She had been 43 years old when the initiative began. She had worn her hair short for 20 years because length was a nuisance in a lab. She had a scar along her left jawline from a cycling accident at 26 that she had never had properly treated because she had believed the surgeon wrongly when he said it would fade. She had never married, though there had been 2 people she had loved. The first she had loved adequately and been loved back adequately, which was enough to be a relationship for 7 years and not enough to be a life. The second she had loved completely and been loved back completely, but at the wrong time, which is to say at a time when Mara's work was consuming most of what she was, not because she chose work over love in any conscious or deliberate way, but because the proof she was working on that year was one of those proofs that gets into your blood. And Priya had understood this and had not resented it exactly, and had eventually, quietly, found someone who was not in the middle of a proof. Priya taught molecular biology. She had a habit of humming while she worked. Not music exactly, sound. The way a machine hums without knowing it hums. The way a room makes a low noise that you only notice when it stops. Mara could not remember sitting in the Vorath cell, the specific tune or tunes. She remembered only the fact of the humming, the way it had made a space feel inhabited, feel like somewhere a person was. She tried sometimes to reproduce it, sitting alone in the amber non-light. What came out was shapeless and off-key, but it was sound. It was her own sound in her own throat. It filled the nothing smell air with something that had come from her. And it helped more than she had expected. She thought about her graduate students. She thought about the whiteboards, the transparencies, the way a proof looks when it is half-built. Not random, not finished, but alive somehow, in the state of becoming something. She thought about the morning she had walked into the briefing and said, "I know what they're measuring." She had been frightened, she admitted to herself now, in ways she had not admitted then. Not of the Vorath, not exactly. Frightened of the implications. Frightened of what it meant that a civilization patient enough to transmit a mathematical catalog for 11 months without response or acknowledgement was now in range of Earth's monitoring systems. Frightened by the gap between that kind of patience and anything she recognized as her own experience of time. But she had understood them. In understanding them, she had, for the first time, understood something about herself, by contrast. Understood what it meant to be the thing she was. She was not patient. She was afraid, and the fear made her go faster, look harder, build quicker, against the locked door, until something gave or she broke trying. She was constitutionally incapable of accepting the fixed conclusion. This was not a virtue necessarily. It was a feature. It was what she was made of. She was not finished. On the 18th, she understood what the lone Vorath, the one who stayed behind, the one she had begun thinking of simply as Ren, a rough phoneme of its pattern signature, was asking. She had worked through it the way she worked through any proof, by eliminating the false branches, following the logic wherever it led regardless of whether the destination was the one she wanted. The question was, do you have a record of what you perceived? Not, what did you see? Not, what do you know? A precise distinction. A distinction she recognized as significant because in Vorath mathematical grammar, which she had been reconstructing from the translator's partial outputs and her own wallotation, the word they used, for record, was the same word they used for image. And both were the same word they used for. These were not 3 different words that happened to share a root. They were one concept with 3 actions. A record was an image. An image was a proof. To have seen something and documented it was to have established it as real. She had a record. She had built it on the wall of the cell over 11 days of scratch notation in a language she had invented for the purpose. Before she had been a prisoner on this ship, before the gap in her memory that she still could not cross, she had been a mathematician who had learned to see the way the Vorath saw. She had learned to read their signal, and in learning to read it, she had begun to perceive things, specific, real, documented things, about the Vorath fleet, not the vessel she was on, the fleet, its composition, trajectory, the mathematical logic of what it was preparing to do. She had records. She had proof. Someone needed that proof. She scratched new notation that night, working quickly, her fingers cramping in the cold adjacent temperature of the cell. Not the careful cataloging she had been doing. Something else. She worked from memory, her mathematical memory, which had holes in the biographical region, but which still held, intact and immovable, everything she had ever derived from first principles. The mathematics was always there. The mathematics did not get captured. It was distributed across her, cellular, stored in any one place that could be taken. She built a proof on the wall. Proof not about abstract numbers, but about numbers with real reference. Fleet coordinates, approach vectors, a timeline, with a specific endpoint she had calculated to within 96 hours of accuracy. She built it in a notation the Vorath would recognize. Chin came the next morning earlier than usual, and stopped. Its membrane went very still. Not dark. The Vorath were never entirely dark. There was always some ambient bioluminescence, some baseline biological activity. But still in a way she had not seen before. She had spent 18 days cataloging Vorath stillness, and this was a new category. Then Ren pulsed. Not the usual interrogation patterns. Not the careful question shapes she had been decoding. Something faster and more complex and multi-layered, simultaneous signal streams rather than sequential. And the translator on the wall made a sound like paper tearing and went silent. She did not need the translator. She had learned to read the light. She looked at the pulsing patterns on Ren's membrane, and she understood not words but the rough shape of what was being communicated. The way you can understand the emotional content of speech in a language you don't yet speak, simply by attending to rhythm, density, to the way a body moves around the sound it makes. What Ren was communicating was not a question. It was something about recognition, about surprise, about a recalibration of expectation. She was almost certain, and she had learned in 18 days to weight her certainties, carefully, that what she was reading was something like awe. She said, quietly, to the room, "You didn't know we could read you that precisely." Light kept moving. "That's what you were measuring," she said. "All of it. Not our technology, not our military capacity, not our numbers or our biology. You wanted to know if we could understand you, if there was any possible basis for." She stopped. The word she reached for had no exact English equivalent. She tried several in her head and put them down. She landed on something that felt more honest, understanding, or maybe recognition. The moment when two things that have been looking at each other across a gap suddenly look at each other. She looked at the proof on the wall. She looked at Ren. "Now you know the other thing," she said. "Now you know what I can see." Ren's membrane went dark. Total darkness. She had never seen that before and did not know what it meant. She waited. Particular human patience that is not patience at all, but stubbornness wearing patience's face. She had gotten good at waiting in this place. She had not been good at it before. She had learned it the way you learn anything in extremity, because you chose to, but because the alternative was something worse. Then slowly, one pulse, a single clear sequence that she could parse without ambiguity. The simplest possible grammatical structure, the equivalent of speaking slowly and clearly in a foreign language to someone you are not sure understands. "We did not know any of your kind had reached this stage." She breathed. "What stage?" she asked. The membrane pulsed again, and the sequence was the foundational one, the one she had decoded first. In those 28 days in the basement, the concept that had been woven through everything else like a load-bearing thread. Imago. They moved her to a larger room. Not immediately. There were internal processes, she gathered, involving beings she did not have access to. But on the 23rd day she was moved, and the new space had two surfaces where she could scratch notation and an angle in the ceiling that caught the ambient light differently and made a shape on the wall that she spent an afternoon staring at before realizing it was an artifact of geometry rather than information. She was still checking. She was always still checking. Ren came twice daily now. They had stopped using the translator. This had been Mara's idea. She had taken the translator unit from the wall, examined it for a few minutes, set it aside, and then communicated a simple mathematical concept using gesture and her own adaptation of the pattern language she had reverse engineered. The concept was, already know some of this. We can go faster without the translation layer losing half of what you're saying. Ren had watched this demonstration with the stillness she had come to associate with processing, and then had responded in a simplified pattern she could follow. And they had begun. It was the hardest intellectual work she had ever done. There was a specific quality of exhaustion that came from it, different from the exhaustion of any previous work, not the pleasant depletion of having solved something X but something, more like the after-feeling of a muscle that has been asked to do something it was not built for, and has done it anyway, and is now figuring out how to rebuild itself along new lines. She worked through it because there was no version of her that did not work through things like this. She had tried, at various points in her life, to be the other version, the version that stopped when the obstacle was sufficiently large. She had never managed it. She had concluded, in her 40s, that this was not something she was capable of choosing. She learned, across many sessions, what Ren wanted her to understand. The Vorath had been watching humanity for far longer than 11 months. The signals the contact team had analyzed were the recent, overt layer. Earlier signals and subtler, embedded in what humans had categorized as background cosmic radiation, noise, the universe's ambient static. This was deliberate. The Vorath were patient in the way geology is patient, in the way of processes that operate on timescales, to which human lifetimes are not meaningful units. They had been watching and cataloging across spans of time she could not quite hold in her head. And what they were waiting for was specific. They were waiting for something to emerge. She thought of the word, imago. The complete form. The thing that emerges, she said, in her home pattern light. What is it that you watch for? Ren's membrane pulsed in a sequence she had to parse so slowly, piece by piece, the way you work a proof that is longer than your working memory. She built it up in sections and held it together and looked at what it made. What it said was this: Vorath had encountered many civilizations across the time span she could not hold in her head. Most civilizations reached a threshold at which their internal conflicts consumed them before they could proceed further. They destroyed themselves with the same cognitive tools that had made them capable of getting as far as they had. The Vorath were interested in the exceptions, in civilizations that developed what Ren's grammar called something she had no single English word, something in the neighborhood of the capacity to understand the other, politically, not philosophically, not as an ideal or a project or a declared value, in practice, in the moment. The actual functional ability to encounter something radically unlike yourself, unlike in biology and communication, in the basic substrate of perception, and, instead of resolving the encounter by destroying the other, or fleeing from it, or imposing your own framework onto it until it broke, to remain still and attend to it and learn to read it, and in being read, be changed. Most species never developed this. They could not get out of their own way long enough. Their survival drives, and their cognitive shortcuts and their pattern-matching algorithms, so useful for survival in the environment they had evolved in, became the thing that prevented them from perceiving anything that did not fit the already established categories. The Vorath had developed it, after a very long time and at significant cost. They had been looking, a very long time, for evidence that something else had too. Mara sat in the new room with its better geometry and its 2 walls for scratching, and let this sit in her for a while. She thought, I was alone in a room with mathematics that was not human mathematics, and I stayed and I looked, until I could read it, she thought. I am here on this ship, and I did not stop. I scratched notation into the wall. I talked to the quiet one. I learned to make light with my hands, she thought. I don't know if that's what they were looking for. I don't know if I'm a representative sample. I don't know if what one person can do in desperation is evidence of anything about a species. Then she thought, it doesn't matter whether it's evidence. I am not doing it to prove something. I am doing it because there is no version of me that doesn't try to read the thing in front of her until it makes sense. She looked at Ren. She said, in pattern light, as clearly as she could manage. I still have the record, the proof about the fleet. Not this ship. The fleet. I know where it's going and when. I know what it's preparing to do. Ren went still. She had learned to read that stillness now. It was not absence. It was attention at its maximum concentration. "I will give it to you," she said. "Not as a transaction, not as leverage, because it's a true thing and true things belong to everyone who needs to know them." She paused. "But I need you to understand something first. Humans already know some of this. Not all of it. They didn't have what I built in here. They didn't have the notation I developed from reading your signal. They don't have the specificity. But they know enough. And what the fleet is preparing to do, the endpoint I've calculated, will not go the way your faction expects, because humans are constitutionally incapable of accepting a fixed conclusion. We always find another way. We find it even when the mathematics says there isn't one. Because we are bad at believing the mathematics when we don't like what it tells us. And this is mostly a flaw, and sometimes the only thing that saves us." She took a breath. "We are not finished. We are never finished. That is the specific, stubborn, inconvenient fact of what we are." The light on Ren's membrane was extraordinary. She had never seen that pattern before and could not parse it fully. Too complex, too simultaneous, too many layers she didn't have the grammar for yet. But she could read the lower frequencies, the simpler underlying structures, the way you can hear the bass note of a chord, even when you can't follow the full harmonic complexity. What she read was not hostility, not dismissal, not the flat assessment of something found wanting. What she read was the closest thing to joy she had seen on this ship in all her days of watching. Ren pulsed one final thing, clearly, slowly, giving her every possible aid to comprehension. "That," it said, "precisely what we were hoping to find." They did not return her immediately. The mathematics of the situation were not simple. There were sessions, many of them, in which she communicated her proof, piece by piece, in pattern light, slowly enough for Ren to verify each step. There were sessions in which she learned things about the Vorath fleet she had not previously known. About its internal structure, which was not politics in any human sense, but was still disagreement. Still different factions with different assessments of what the correct course. The faction that had captured her was not the dominant faction. This was information she needed and had not had. She helped Ren build a counter-argument. She did this the way she built everything, precisely without sentiment from first principles. The mathematics of the situation she demonstrated were these. A civilization that had produced even one mind capable of reading Vorath signal, language and communicating back in it, was not a civilization in the category the dominant faction had assigned it. The categorization implied a different set of possible interactions. The different interactions had different projected outcomes. She quantified the projected outcomes. She was thorough. She had not survived on this ship by being approximate. She did not know whether Ren won the argument. What she knew was that one period of rest later, they came to get her. Not the interrogators. Not the group that had been coming daily. Ren and two others she had not seen before, who moved differently. Faster, more deliberate, with the quality of beings who had a purpose and were executing it. They brought her through a sequence of rooms she recognized as a transition, protocol of some kind, a threshold between categories of space. And then there was a chamber and a door, and through the door there was a shuttle, and in the shuttle there were people. Two humans in suits she did not recognize, which meant the suits were new, which meant time had passed. More time than she had calculated, or time had moved differently here than she had assumed. A man with a shaved head and the particular bearing of someone who had made many difficult decisions under significant pressure, and was still in the middle of making them. A woman with copper sheen eyes who Mara recognized before she recognized anything else about her. Dr. Amara Ose, the linguist, still wearing the retinal implants. Still carrying the small, efficient stillness she brought to every room she entered. The man started to say something procedural, and Mara held up her hand. She needed one moment. She turned back to the doorway. Ren was there, membrane pulsing a slow, simple pattern, the simplest possible, chosen deliberately, a pattern even a beginning reader could parse. It said, continue. She thought about what she was going to go back to, the whiteboards, the transparencies, the work. The hard, necessary, ongoing, Never finished work of reading the thing in front of you until it yields, of staying in the room when the room is dark and cold and smells of nothing. She thought about Priya's humming, and the scar along her jaw, and the tag she was still holding in her left hand. Warm, number 47. The only thing on this ship that had felt familiar. She thought about her graduate students, who would be waiting, who would have questions, who would need to be told things that would take a long time to say properly. She said in pattern light as clearly as she had ever said anything, in the language she had built from nothing in a room, with no right angles and no smell. We will. Then she turned around and walked through the door. The man with the shaved head said, "Dr. Sellen, General Thatch, we have a lot of ground to cover." "I know," she said. "Are you?" "I'm fine." She found she meant it, which surprised her less than she expected. "I have a proof to deliver, and after that I need to sleep, and after that I need whiteboards. Several. And I need to talk to your linguists, specifically Dr. Osi. And I need someone to get me a decent cup of coffee, because I have been drinking whatever the Vorath consider adequate hydration for what I suspect is longer than I realize, and it is not coffee." Dr. Osi made a sound that was almost entirely a laugh. The shuttle detached from the Vorath ship and the stars, slid sideways, and through the window the ship itself retreated, hull faintly luminescent against the absolute dark of open space. Not broadcasting, not pulsing in any pattern she was reading as communication, just the soft ambient light of something that was alive, in a way she had spent months trying to understand, and would spend the rest of her life finding her understanding of. She had made a beginning. She had made a beginning that looked like something, that pointed somewhere. That was not nothing. The proof existed, the contact existed, the channel existed, imperfect and effortful, and requiring two parties willing to stay in the room with each other and keep working. And through that channel, if it held, if the argument she had helped build landed the way she had calculated it might, there was a version of what came next that did not end in fire. She could not guarantee the proof would be enough. She could not guarantee the channel would hold. She could not guarantee anything about the fleet, Wren's faction, or the specific 96-hour window in her calculations. She could guarantee only one thing, and it was not a guarantee in the traditional sense. It was a fact. A stubborn, irrefutable, specifically and irreducibly human fact. They would not stop. Whatever happened, whatever doors closed, whatever certainties collapsed, they would find the pattern underneath and the rule. Underneath the pattern and thing. Underneath the rule that had no name yet but could be found, if you stayed in the room with it long enough, if you did not accept the static conclusion, if you remained, always and in every sense of the word, unfinished. The shuttle shook as its engines caught, and she gripped the armrest with both hands. The tag was in her palm. She looked down at it. 47. Warm, alien, the one thing on the ship that had felt like something she had touched before. She closed her fingers around it and held it there, and thought, a record, an image, a proof. They were the same word in a language she had built from nothing, the same concept with three expressions. She had seen something. She had documented it. That made it real. She looked out the window at the dark and thought, good, let's see what's out there. The shuttle broke free of the Vorath ship's gravity well and accelerated toward the small pale point of light that was Earth, and behind her the alien ship turned. She could see it in the window's reflection, just barely, a slow arc, course correction. And she did not know if it was redirecting or simply repositioning, and she would not know for 96 hours. Maybe longer. The mathematics never delivered certainty. They delivered probability, and probability delivered you to the edge of the unknown and said, now walk. She had been walking since she was 9 years old. Since she had first felt the shape of a proof in her hands, like something warm. Dr. O.C. leaned forward in her seat and said quietly, not to anyone in particular, we picked up a course change from the secondary fleet 6 minutes ago. About 40 of their ships broke off from the approach vector. She looked at Mara. Did you know that would happen? Mara thought about Wren's membrane going dark. The single pulse afterward. That is precisely what we were hoping to find. I thought it was possible, she said. I helped make an argument. I don't know yet if it was enough. 40 ships is not nothing, General Thatch said. No, she agreed. 40 ships is not nothing. She looked at the tag in her hand, 47. She wondered if the Vorath numbered things by order of importance rather than order of capture. She wondered if she had misread the numbering system entirely, and the tag meant something she had not yet decoded. She made a note to herself. She kept notes in her head now, had always done this, but the habit was more discipline after months of having no other medium to investigate the possibility when she had access to the accumulated signal data again. There was a great deal of work to do. There always was. She was not stopping now.